Hey everybody, today I wanted to take a few minutes to go over the exposure triangle, which is the ISO, shutter speed, and aperture settings on your camera. Each of those settings affects the other, and those three things together are what make a good photographic exposure. So to demonstrate, I've set up a little tableau here on my kitchen table. Nothing fancy, just some knickknacks from around the house and a piece of black foam core, for drama. The first thing I want to point out is the light. Where is the light coming from? In this case, it's coming from directly above, right? It's just my kitchen overhead light. So it's coming directly down onto the objects on the table. So it's going to have a particular effect on the shadows and the way they fall over the objects on the table. To show you how the quality of the light changes the settings in the camera, I'm going to put the camera on a program or automated setting and look at how each of those elements of the exposure triangle change. So I've set my camera to P for program, and I'll change the ISO setting to auto. What that does is allows the camera to choose the settings for a correct exposure. I'll half press my shutter, and under this light condition, it tells me I will be ISO 6400, f4.5, that's the aperture, and 1/60th shutter speed. I haven't properly focused this, so I'm going to turn the focus ring on the front of the camera until I get the middle of this still life in focus. Press the shutter. 1/60th shutter speed, f4.5, ISO, whatever it was. Now, I'm going to change the lighting situation. I'll turn this light off, and you see how that changes our look here in the camera. I'll go ahead and half press my shutter, and now it says 1/15th of a second, f4.5, at ISO 6400. Now I'll turn on the light on the other side of the room. So now we have a light coming in from the left side of the objects on the table. I'll half press my shutter. We're still focused on the same area. Now it says 1/20th of a second, f4.5, ISO 6400. So you see how each of those settings is changing based on the amount of light. Now I'm going to turn on the overhead light as well. And I'll go ahead and open a little bifold door over here to let some sunlight in. Now when we look at it, we've got that overhead light is really creating a deep shadow here, a hard shadow underneath our elephant. Let's see what kind of settings we get. 1/60th of a second, f4.5, at ISO 5000. So with more light, the shutter speed was able to become faster, 1/60th of a second, much faster than the 1/15th that we saw earlier. I'm going to turn this overhead light off. So now we have light coming from the left and from the right. And I half press the shutter, 1/20th of a second, there's less light, f4.5 again, and ISO 6400. Click. So now when we look at the results of these pictures, we can see how each of those settings changed as the lighting situation changed. I'm going to go ahead and turn the overhead light back on. We'll live with that shadow for now. And we'll get into the exposure triangle exercise. For this one, I am going to change the camera's setting to M, or manual. And now, with the camera in manual, we're going to change each of those settings individually to see how that affects our exposure. Okay, so I'll go ahead and reset this to, that's white balance. I'm going to put the white balance on auto for this exercise. Now I'll press my ISO button, which is the light sensitivity of the camera sensor, and I'll put it on 100, my lowest ISO I can get. I'll change my other settings, my shutter speed and my f-stop or aperture to get a correct exposure. can see now I have to use a 2.5 second exposure at f8 and ISO 100 to get a properly exposed image. So I'll go ahead and click that. So ISO controls light sensitivity in the camera. ISO 100 is the least sensitive to light, so ISO 100 is a daylight, outside ISO. Now let's change the ISO up to something like 800. Now the meter on the camera is telling us +3, right? With that 2.5 second exposure at f8, it's now 3 stops of light overexposed, because I've made the camera more sensitive to light by increasing the ISO to ISO 800. In order to get a good exposure, to make this camera meter read 0 again, I'm going to change the time, the shutter speed. The reason I don't want to change the f-stop is because I want that amount of focus. Aperture, or f-stop, controls the depth of field, or what things are in focus. You know, this is a 5-foot table, and I've got things kind of spread out over the table, and I want all of them to be in focus. So at ISO 800, to get a normal exposure, the meter says 0 in the middle. F8, everything in focus that I want, I'm going to use a 1/3 of a second shutter speed. So ISO 800 is kind of a middle of the road ISO. You can kind of go inside and outside, but you see how even at ISO 800 and f8, I had to make a shutter speed that was going to be too long for me to hand hold. Now let's make it extremely sensitive to light. I'm going to change the ISO. I'll press the ISO button again, and I'll move it all the way up. My maximum ISO on my camera is 51,200, right there. And this is telling me that at f8 and ISO 51,200, I'm 3 stops overexposed. So we have to change that shutter speed. We have to make it faster. And that's right here in the 250 range. Oops, and to get 0 on our meter, right there, it's 1/200th of a second at ISO 51,200 and f8. So we'll go ahead and click here. Boop. These 3 images will, as far as the camera is concerned, be equivalent at ISO 100, ISO 800, and ISO 51,200. We had to change the shutter speed each time because we wanted the depth of field, or things that were in focus in the image, to stay where they were at. So f8 is is a relatively small aperture. So right now let's change that. To do the aperture exercise, I'm going to set my ISO to 1600. I'm indoors. The camera doesn't think this is as much light as like our human eyes might see. ISO 1600 gives the camera a pretty good sensitivity level for indoors light like this. So I'll set ISO 1600 and change the aperture now and see how that affects the exposure triangle. From f8, I'm going to open the aperture up all the way, the maximum opening for light onto the sensor of the camera. In this case, it's f4.5. But at f4.5 and ISO 1600, 1/200th shutter speed is too fast. I'm 3 stops too dark. So now, in order to keep my f4.5 aperture, I have to make the shutter speed longer. I have to use a 1/20th of a second shutter speed, which is too slow to hand hold, which is why I have the camera set up on a tripod. Click. Now I'm going to change the aperture to get more things in focus. Let's put it somewhere, like let's say f11. f11 is a smaller opening for light on the sensor of the camera, and the meter is telling us it's 2 2/3 stops too dark, minus. So for my ISO 1600, which is my acceptable ISO for the resolution of the final image, and f11, which is the amount of things that I need in focus in this image, a 1/20th of a second is too short because I've made the light opening smaller. So now we have to make the shutter speed longer to 1/3 of a second. I'll click that. I'll press the shutter. We're not going to see a very shallow depth of field on these images because there's not a lot of depth in this image. And f4 is the widest opening that this specific lens has. Other cameras can open up to like 2 and 1.4, so they would have a much, creamier blur and a lot more separation. So we'll see what we get with this, but I don't expect to see a huge difference. Now from f11, I'm going to go up to as high as I can, f22. Now f22 at ISO 1600, the meter is telling me I'm 2 stops too dark, -2. So because I've made the aperture much smaller, there's less light coming in to hit the sensor. And so because of that, I need the shutter to stay open longer to let more light in through this smaller hole. 1.3 seconds, f22, ISO 1600 gives me a meter reading of 0, middle. And we might be able to see more of kind of the hallway, that bookshelf back there might be in focus now because f22 gives us a much longer depth of field. Go ahead and I'll snap that. All right, now as we look at these aperture change images, we'll see that the depth of field changes, or what is in and out of focus changes based on how close or far away it is from the camera. And then the final point of the exposure triangle is shutter speed. Shutter speed manages motion, whether you can freeze motion or blur it. Think of sports or waterfalls. And to do that, I'm going to move some things in the image and we'll see what happens. Because shutter speed controls motion and whether we're stopping or blurring it, I thought we would bring in Mr. Tubi to dance around a little for us and help us out with this part of the demo. First thing I want to do is focus, and I'm going to just touch my screen here and press AF to have it focus for me on Tubi himself. Let's say I want to freeze motion. I want to stop Tubi in his tracks, catch him in the middle of some kind of dance move. All right, so I want to stop motion. I'm going to change my shutter speed to something very fast. I'm going to go up to 1,000 shutter speed, 1/1000th of a second. And I know though at f22 that's going to be, I'm not going to be able to do that. The shutter speed is too fast and the aperture is too small, even at ISO 1600, to let the proper amount of light in. I wouldn't mind all of that stuff in the background falling out of focus because I really want this picture of Tubi. So I'm going to change my f-stop, my aperture, because that will both help me to have the shutter speed that I want to freeze motion and will help the background blur a little more and get my meter up to 0. So I'm going to change the aperture from f22 down to f5.5 is the widest aperture I can get with this lens. So that's the best I can do as far as aperture. I'm still -3 on the meter. So I'm going to take ISO 1600 and I have to change that. I have to raise it up to make it more sensitive to light. And so even at ISO 51,200, the maximum ISO, 1/1000th of a second is still underexposed. So I'm going to have to sacrifice some motion. Let's cut that 1/1000th in half to 1/500th of a second. We'll free up Tubi again. He's caught. He's been dancing a long time. All right, there he goes. He's having a good time. So even at ISO 51,200 and f5.5 at 1/500th of a second, under this light, it's still a little too dark. I'll change my shutter speed just a little slower. I don't want to go much slower than 1/400th because he's moving pretty fast. Boop. He's frozen. He's stopped in motion. No blur. Well, maybe a little blur. He's moving pretty fast. But ISO 51,200 gives us a different kind of resolution, a lot grainier. Let's say I want to put some motion blur in it, right? 1/400th is the fastest I can do under this light condition. So I'll go with 1/100th, right? This is about as slow as you can handhold 1/100th of a second. f5.5, because I want to give him a little motion blur at 1/100th, I want to maintain my depth of field, the things that are in focus, and that gives me +2 at ISO 51,200. Because I don't want to change the things in focus or the amount of motion blur, I'm going to change the ISO to get that meter reading that I want. And at 12,800 ISO, the meter tells me 0, that this is a proper exposure. I'll go ahead and click that. And finally, I'm going to come on down to 1 second. Now we're going to get a lot of motion blur. Again, I don't want to change the depth of field, so I won't change my f5.5. Your camera lens may go lower than that to, f4, f2. This specific lens goes to f5.5 at best. All right, so again, I want a specific amount of motion blur. I don't want to change the things that are in or out of focus. And that at ISO 12,800 tells me that I'm 3 stops overexposed. So again, I want to change the ISO. I have to go way down now. ISO 125. Right, because of the amount of motion blur that I want, 1 second's worth, I'm letting in a lot of light over the course of 1 second. In order to make a proper exposure now, I have to make the camera sensor through its ISO the least sensitive to light as possible, so that that will allow me to have 1 second worth of light coming in. So now I'll click the shutter, and that one gives us all kinds of motion blur. So that's a look at how the exposure triangle works in photography to make a proper exposure. I hope that helps. Thanks for your attention. Take care.